Hello and welcome to episode 16 of our Walk in My Shoes series. Thank you very much for joining us as we enter our 5th month of these webinars. I can't believe it's July already. My name is Zofia Sahanik and I'm Director in Training Development at Philanthropy Impact, and your moderator for this session and also the person to contact to discuss membership or to ask about any of our training. Today we will be discussing the impact of recent events on cross-border giving. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our chair for today, Simon Weil,
Weil, actually.
Weil, I knew I'd get it wrong. BDB Pitmans LLLP. Joining him is Etienne Eichenberger. Thank you. I got that one right, yes. Managing Partner at Weil Philanthropy Advisors and Chairman of Swiss Philanthropy Foundation. Ludwig Forrest, Head of International Philanthropy at King Baudouin Foundation. And Martin Georgi, Chair of the German Fundraising Association and Board Member of EUConsult. As with all our events, I ask that you remain respectful to the discussion, the panel and each other. Use the chat function to interact and ask questions. As this is a strictly 30-minute session, we will be taking the discussion to LinkedIn afterwards, and the link will be in the chat for you, so please do join us. I will now hand over to Simon to begin this discussion. Thank you very much, Simon.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is a very long-running saga, transnational giving, not least in its European context, because as the panelists will recall, there was an attempt to create a genuine EU framework for transnational giving that failed, unfortunately. And so, although we have all sorts of facilitators, and I'm sure Ludwig can tell us more about the Transnational Giving Europe mechanism, which now embraces a large number of countries, we still have what amounts to a landlock. Interestingly, from a UK perspective, we've actually made a bit of progress on this front, because back in 2010, the Finance Act enabled people to make gifts to charities that were in the European Union, Norway or Iceland, provided the charitable objects were charitable according to the law of England and Wales, which looked great, but of course it was hedged about with all sorts of caveats, including HMRC approval of the relevant overseas charity. So, so some progress has been made, but I think we have a long way to go. And I'd like to kick off this afternoon's discussion by asking Ludwig about what the King Baudouin Foundation's experience has been in supporting cross-border giving through the Transnational Giving Europe Network. So Ludwig, could you comment?
Thank you, Simon. And indeed, we know each other for years, and we have done what we have done already, many efforts towards national authorities and towards the European Union and the European Commission, European Parliament, to try to improve this situation. Progresses were made, as you said, also inside the European Union with the fundamental freedoms in the UK, in other countries that did take very good decisions, but still it is not that easy. Even though, and together with Etienne, we will give you some examples, things are progressing. Some countries are taking the right decisions. We know of Luxembourg, we know of the Netherlands, we know in some countries that they allow cross-border donations with the same advantages as if given to a national beneficiary. We know that the discussions are going on. You have the European Foundation Center, you have Daphne, backed by the European Fundraising Association, EUConsult, Philanthropy Impact. We are always trying to find new ways. So these are progresses that are easing a little bit. And then you have indeed, as you said, Transnational Giving Europe, that is now there since 20 years, and that is covering 21 countries. So even if you face difficulties, you can inform about Transnational Giving Europe. The clear example is the following one. You are a UK beneficiary, you want to fundraise in 20 other countries in Europe, Germany, Belgium, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, Spain, Switzerland, and so on and so on. You just have to register with the Charities Aid Foundation. They will validate you, which is very easy. With the Charity Commission, we are all very jealous about the Charity Commission in continental Europe, but it is very easy to validate yourself. And then doors are opening in 20 countries. Doors for regular transfers, and since last Monday, and this is probably the breaking news, if we can have breaking news in those 20 years, we have also now a digital platform where people will be able to make online donations from those 20 countries. I will put on the chat an example of a fund under the umbrella of the King Baudouin Foundation, but it could have been another one. And you will see how easy it will be to make online donations for beneficiaries. I will put it immediately now. Yep. So you can have a look while I speak. So by clicking on this link and by putting this link on your websites of beneficiaries in UK or wherever you are based in Europe, you will be able to allow to your donors to make online donations. So this is one out of the many steps that are taken next to the efforts that are done by intermediaries like yourself, Simon, like your companies, in addition to the cases that we are facing, in addition to people that are already making cross-border donations and deducting it from their taxes, in addition to what does Transnational Giving Europe, what does the King Baudouin Foundation, the Swiss Philanthropy Foundation, and so on. These efforts will bring, at least at one day, it will go for this single market for philanthropy in Europe, and that's our dream for all of us.
Of course, this online Transnational Giving Europe platform, which you mentioned, which was launched on the 29th of June, clearly that is a step forward, but would I not be right in understanding that although it's a logistical and technological move forward, it doesn't actually change the law in any way? No. Fortunately, it was built with some big actors like Fedora, Swiss Philanthropy Foundations contributed to it, Common Goal, the Football Pledge movement, and also Creative Europe from the European Commission. So they all supported this tool, and it is nothing more than a tool. We all agree on that. But what the vision is that by multiplying those initiatives, and Etienne will tell you about another one, by multiplying this initiative, by having big players using those kinds of tools, this will generate political will to change things and to probably, hopefully, adapt the laws accordingly to what they should be already, which is a better place for philanthropy in Europe and for cross-border philanthropy in Europe. Okay, thank you, Ludwig. I'd like to move on now to Etienne. Etienne, I'd like to ask you about what you would identify as the barriers or incentives that may sway philanthropists when deciding where to base their foundation.
Wow, it's a big question for a non-lawyer person, so it's a bit of a challenge. But no, I think it's my experience is that we emphasize a lot taxes in the motivation of the donors to set up the trust, but I don't think that's so essential for many of the people with whom I work. I'm not dismissing it's an issue, but I think like eventually other decisions you take where taxes play a big role in your conversations, I don't think when you set up your own foundations, the notions of when to implement it because of taxes is central. I think taxes is the means to an end and people reflect how to adjust it accordingly. And I think the question sometimes from my perspective, if I may rephrase your questions, is more what kind of vehicle do I want? Is it my own foundations or is it a fund within an umbrella foundations? Or is it simply just making a gift? And I think we experience the three. And I think depending on the kind of experience or the kind of resources you have as a donor, as a family, as a company, as an organization, you might choose one of the others. None is better than others, but some are right for you or not right for you giving. So, and I think in that space, I think TGE and the transnational giving and the cross-border giving is a fantastic incentive, which as being based in Switzerland, I find someone is not as known as it should, because it's actually something that just that makes things easy or easier. And I'm thinking, for instance, with if I may give two examples, we've been approached, like many of us, but I think it's an interesting example to show how it can work. Besides, and as such, it's an incentive. The Verbier Festival, which is a music festival in Switzerland, was running, as many festivals in summer did have to cancel, and they were concerned about some of the musicians that were out of home, so with not anymore with parents, but not yet very established. That profile of younger professionals, because that's also the space of the festivals. And they've been able to fundraise across Europe from donors, and they've been able to fund hundreds of musicians across Europe. And the fund was based in Switzerland. It could have been based in our friends in Germany, or with Baudouin or CAF in UK. It was based in Switzerland because the festival here. And in realities, it was a fantastic tools, and it was a great incentive for people in that sense, rather to give more than to question if they would give. So that make me think, and often think, that you don't give because it's tax exempt, but it makes things faster, easier, and smoother. And it's not only about taxes, it's also about the reinsurance that actually you might have a partners that makes safe the transfer of money to the end beneficiaries. So that's one example I'd like to take. The other example.
Can I just stop you there? Was it the Swiss Philanthropy Foundation that was the vehicle?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm chairman of the board of that foundation. In that capacity, I carry also that hat. So thank you for making that specific. It's right. And if I may take another example to say that I think the locations where you start your foundations is to my extent, since we're talking about cross-border giving and therefore also our taxes, I think it's secondary. We've been running with numerous partners, but with the co-leadership of the United Nations Foundations, a fund in the context of the WHO COVID campaign. I mean, the WHO approached us because it was based in Geneva, Switzerland. It had historical partners in the US with United Nations Foundation. It wanted to run a campaign launched end of February, so pretty early on if we think about the campaign of COVID. I mean, we have crossed within 4 months $500,000, and none of them was giving before to WHO, because WHO couldn't receive money from private donors or from corporates. So, I mean, it's, and I also mentioned that because it was an international campaign. We've run, we've crossed 222 million, I think, last week. But a big part came across Europe, and the TGE was completely crucial to run that campaign. And I was looking at the number this morning to prepare our call, and I mean, the money flow that came through COVID is reaching almost the 12 millions, a bit less than that, 11.8 millions. And when you think that last year our total giving through the networks was 13.8 millions, Ludwig, if I'm not mistaken, I think that was mentioned last week. I mean, with one campaign, we've been able to see that actually there is an appetite, and actually the buyers might not be as big as we think, because the network is in place, partners are very credible, 20 years of track record is something in the world which is a very key asset. So, that's I think is an incentive to do more.
Yes, yes. It's interesting what you're saying about COVID, because my experience, I'm on the board of a charity that actually supports a charity called the Children's Radio Foundation that is based in South Africa and other African countries. And COVID became a central theme for that charity, because it was a means of, through the radios, of communicating best practice and safety to all the listeners. And as a result of that, the funding for that charity increased markedly, because it was able to demonstrate that it was expressly operating in a COVID cause. So that's obviously quite a significant factor. At this point, I'd like to move on to Martin. And Martin, I'd like to ask you, from a charity perspective, receiving or seeking funding, what are the current major challenges, risks and opportunities, would you say?
Well, thank you. Thank you for being able to participate here. And I think part of the thing that I see according to this issue is a complete shall I say, provincial view that is still established with many organizations. And I think the reality is that many organizations tend to just think in their established parameters. So for example, if I'm a local organization dealing with homelessness, or the example just mentioned, if I'm dealing with a festival, I tend to think only of the existing people that I have already been linked to and that I'm already working with. And I think the first step is to have a bit of information and a bit of a view beyond your local or provincial parameters. So for example, if you're working in one particular city in Germany and you're helping the homeless in Berlin, it's difficult already for many people to think that there might be donors or institutions outside of Berlin that would like to fund you. And that goes then also beyond the borders. Why should only someone in Cologne fund a project in Berlin, and why should not someone in Brussels also be willing to fund a project in Berlin? After all, in many other aspects of our work, we've become very international over the past years in terms of our travel, in terms of our business decisions, in terms of our life choices, where we study, where we marry, where we live. So why shouldn't, in terms of donations, we take a more international approach? And I think it's for me, from the point of view of the organizations, it's the limited view that many organizations have, that they don't have the experience or even the ambition to go beyond a certain border. And it's much more comfortable in many ways to just do the fundraising or the research for funding and foundations and so on in your own close parameter, rather than going beyond that parameter. And I'm often quite surprised when I talk to organizations, when I say, well, there are, foundations in the United States which fund the type of work that they're doing. And then they look at me really surprised and say, but why should I apply for money in the United States? Well, because there's money there. Why don't you apply there? So, I mean, this is the first thing that I think, this provincial view and the lack of ambition. The second point, I would echo what Etienne said. I think there are some tax issues, clearly, for some donors and some institutions. They have tax and regulatory issues. But in many other areas of our work, we're quite willing to invest and to work also with without a tax certificate or without that type of incentive. And I think that's both within our countries, but also without. So if you have a good cause and if you can sell it well and you have a campaign character to it and a kind of need which is expressed, then that is, I think, the predominant issue, and to make the appropriate link to the foundation and to the donor. So if that is existing, the tax issue or the way of transfer and which bank are we going to use and how am I going to register it and whatever, that's a minor issue. It's a technical issue which does play a role. But if there's no ambition there to even get the money moving, why start worrying about the tax issue first? I think that's the second or third point. And I think also it's a question of size, because if there's only so few international donations, why should the bureaucrat or any regulations if it's only a minute part of giving which is actually crossing the borders? Why should there be special regulations? So I think we need to establish the need and make it more commonplace and make it more normal to transfer money across borders. And there already are many ways, because as you mentioned in the introduction, in many countries, for example, also in Germany, it is possible as well, if you can show that the charity you are supporting in another European country is appropriate to the charity work that's done in Germany, you can already now apply for tax benefits. And I think the other issue we have is that we have to value our work more. That goes both for the work of the organizations, but also for the work of legal analysis or specialists who are supporting us. We think nothing of paying 5% or 9%, I think it is even, for a small PayPal transfer. But then when we start to worry about transferring donations, everybody gets really upset when they're supposed to be paying 4% or 5% or even 10% overhead or transfer fees or legal advice or whatever else. And I think in many organizations, there's a tendency to want to, give as much money, of course, to the project as possible. And in many donors as well, who would not question a bank transfer fee of 6% or 8%, but when an organization or a legal expert says, I'd like to have a 5%, advice fee or something, they go, oh my God, 5%, So I think we need to value our work and say it's worth something, and the expertise we provide among organizations is also something that needs to be paid for.
Yeah. There's one point on which I'd like to take issue with you there. You say that tax incentives and exemptions and reliefs are very minor. I think, speaking as a professional advisor in this field, actually the more there are of such things, the easier it is for the professional to introduce the subject of philanthropy into the conversation with his or her client, because in a way, if there are such things legally available, it would be almost negligent for a professional not to draw the client's attention to them. So I think the bigger and better toolbox you've got, it becomes easier for the professional advisor to engage in a philanthropy conversation with the client when discussing their affairs generally. So I would maintain that was still very, very important.
I would agree with you that but I would say the other issue is actually even thinking international in the first place, because a lot of times, we tend to think in a national perspective, but if we take an international perspective and also look at the potential donor as being international, because the donor, whether this is a high net worth individual or foundation, they might already have some international links. Most donors have traveled. Most donors have even lived in another country. They might have actually married someone from another country, et cetera, et cetera. That's how Nigel Farage is so international, because he has a German wife. That's just wonderful how this internationalism just works, even, and it immediately influences people. No, I'm just kidding. But I think we have to see people as being, having international relationships, and international relationships as being something normal. And if we establish that, then I would agree with you. Then, of course, the bigger toolbox, and transnational giving, Europe might be one thing, but we should go also beyond Europe. Why shouldn't money come from the United States or from South Korea? And there are rich people sitting in China these days, as I hear. So why shouldn't Chinese people also be able to contribute to activities in Europe, even without tax benefits? I'm just asking for the ambition and for the international outlook, which I think is missing. Where it's not missing, interestingly enough, is in the field of development, because in the field of development, organizations have traditionally gone for an international perspective. The idea being that you need to support a project in Ghana and you need to support it from Europe. That's been a traditional view, but it's limited to the field of development cooperation, and it has a very paternalistic atmosphere. I would argue for a much more cooperative atmosphere, where we say we have joint tasks, and if you're a donor interested in homelessness, why should you only fund projects in London? You could as well fund an interesting homeless project in Cologne or in Stuttgart, which might give you much more of an impact than a badly run project in Liverpool. So you'd want to compare the quality of the projects and have access to people who can tell you about the project in Stuttgart. And then I'm sure many donors would say, well, why shouldn't I fund a good project in Stuttgart? I don't need to only go to Liverpool.
Yeah. One question I'd like to throw open to all three of you actually is, to what extent is bureaucracy, red tape, micromanaging regulation a barrier to philanthropists doing what they want to do? When I say this, I'm thinking of the extremely burdensome audit regulations that are creeping in the UK, where you can have a really very straightforward, plain vanilla grant giving charity, which has to spend an inordinate amount of time providing material to the auditors in order to conform to best practice guidelines. I gather that this is one of the reasons why international financial centers like the Channel Islands are making real headway in philanthropy at the expense of the metropolitan states, such as the UK or indeed the member states of the EU. Does this resonate with any of you?
Mm-hmm. I think I've heard that and experienced that as well, that regulation is always an issue in terms of also how quickly a donor can be separated from his or her money. So, that's of course what we want to do. We want to separate the person from his or her money as quickly as possible. And the more regulations there are and the more things that have to be examined is of course an issue. But I have seen the bigger barriers, in fact, within the organizations. And that's why I think this transnational giving initiative is a good initiative, because it's actually pooling resources from different countries. I've made the experience, unfortunately, that between organizations, there's much more of a competitive feeling rather than a cooperative one. It's because the same type of setup that's being set up from International Giving in Europe could be set up as well between different organizations who could partner. And donors quite often are irritated when they see competition between organizations because they expect organizations to cooperate. And among organizations, we tend to say, oh, it's better if they give to World Vision than to Plan International, or it's better if they give to Bread for the World than for Miserio. But in fact, the donor doesn't care much. The donor wants to have an impact, and we tend to be very provincial about our fees. And I remember one big donor, which when I was still working for Amnesty International, we were arguing for a long time with him how to give money to us. And in fact, the donation didn't come about because the Amnesty branches couldn't agree which percentage should go to which Amnesty branch. And the donor was just fed up with us after a while and said, well, forget it. So, I mean, the red tape, yes, but I think the red tape is also within the organizations, and a lack of willingness to cooperate, which I think is more stifling, in fact, than the actual audit requirements. And I think, on the other hand, some of the audit requirements are quite useful, and it deals more with the professionalization of the sector. And for some organizations, they really need to improve their work because they're still not providing good accounting and good reporting. And in fact, they could improve their work. And there's a hesitation to that, of course.
Simon, I think your question allows us to address a common goal, a common objectives, which you have, which we all have with Swiss Philanthropy Foundation, umbrella foundations, King Baudouin Foundations, and all philanthropic advisors, wealth advisors. It is to enable philanthropy, really to allow a donor, to a philanthropist, to a family, a corporate donor, to find easy solution. Is it within your region, within your community, or is it at an international level? And so, yes, we are trying to diminish, all of us, the red tape. We are advocating for proportionate measures at EU level against terrorism financing, anti-money laundering, and so on and so on. We just are making all the efforts to facilitate the engagement in philanthropy, to allow them to allow philanthropists to concentrate on what they like, which is action and impact.
Yeah. Etienne, do you have any comments?
I mean, it's a great conversation, but frankly, I think some level of control by state is useful, because when you give, you have a tax benefit. So I would not be from the school to say, any control is useless and bury some. It's normal. I mean, if you want, you don't need a tax. If you don't want the burdens, don't ask for the tax incentive, give directly. If you go with tax incentive, is that you accept a certain level of, not control, but to make sure. The big questions is, are the norm of the control made for the few that tried to go around the law, or is the norm, with the level playing, where is the level playing field? So I think where you set the control and the efficiency of the administration is clearly at the center. In Switzerland, sometimes the coordinations between different administrations is a concern, but in general, I think some level of control is fair. And if you're annoyed by that, then don't ask for the tax incentive and make your gift.
Now, one thing I've been asked to ask, does any of you think Brexit has made any difference in this context?
Ask the Swiss. No, Ludwig told me once the networks might only exist for the Swiss, and now it might exist only for the Swiss and the Brits. No, I think we have been enjoying an amazing collaboration within the networks, and CAF, I think, is experiencing the same things, and we look forward to continue that collaborations. I mean, Ludwig can certainly comment on that, but that's not our experience. At contrary, I think it will go on.
Right. Thank you.
I've had the experience that I think Brexit has refocused a lot of the thinking. I think, in fact, it has strengthened the European cooperation, because people have said, well, we've got to be careful that this doesn't happen to other countries, and people have rediscovered the value of working internationally, even with the Brits, because, obviously in many international associations, the British or Scottish or Irish participants are quite important. And I think it has rediscovered that value. So in a certain sense, I think in some ways, Brexit will challenge us to do even better.
Thank you, Martin.
And you could say that Brexit is actually a way of globalizing transnational giving and not just thinking in terms of the European Union.
Okay, I'm going to cut in here now. We have 1 minute left. Thank you very much. I think we're just starting this discussion. Leaving aside the comment about Nigel Farage. Thanks, Martin. You just made Simon stay. I would just say thank you to all of you, Etienne, Ludwig, and Martin, and Simon. We've just started to scratch the surface, so I think we're going to have a follow-up to this. There are some questions that are left to be answered. Okay, so we're just about out of time, but I'm going to use my authority to go over by 2 minutes. So could I have final words of wisdom, if you could keep it to 30 seconds? So Martin, that's your challenge. Can you do it in 30 seconds? Final word of wisdom.
I think we just need to be more ambitious. I think we the point is not to solve individual issues, but to solve the bigger ones, and that should motivate us to overcome some of the small problems that we're facing here and there. And Brexit will be just a minor blip on in the words of history. I think we'll be over that soon.
Okay, and Ludwig.
Philanthropy is complementary to public action. So philanthropy is necessary. Philanthropy is possible within the countries. Cross-border philanthropy is possible, and indeed there is some ambition to go beyond Europe.
Okay, thank you. Etienne.
I have 10 seconds. Use the International Giving online that Ludwig has sent you. It's a nice experience. Go through it and try it.
Thank you. Simon, final word to you.
Okay, I'd like to extend the Finance Act 2010 so that you can give worldwide and get the tax benefits provided the objects are charitable according to English law.
Thank you, Simon. That was really terrific. Sophia, over to you.
Thank you all so much. It seems that ambition and collaboration seem to be a running theme for all of our Walking My Shoes discussions, which I think is really interesting. Please, audience, do come and join us on LinkedIn for any further questions or to carry on the discussion. You can also find the recording of today there. Next week, we'll be discussing social entrepreneurship and philanthropy and innovation in the space with Rennie Hall, Bonnie Chu and Matthew Bocock. Please get in touch with any ideas for topics and speakers you would like to hear from us. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to end it now. Thanks to everyone that joined and to the panelists. Bye-bye.
Thank you.